Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Pits of Motor Chaos. This is your host, Dave. I got a special guest, former funny car driver, Casey Spurlock. How you doing, Casey?
I'm doing great this evening. How about you?
I'm pretty good.
Good.
So how many years has it been since you've retired from drag racing?
I quit driving funny cars in '95. I went back and drove a few top fuel races in 2003, but actually here lately I've been getting the itch, and so I'm, believe it or not, beginning the process of renewing my license, and could be in a fuel funny car by the end of the year, if not certainly next year.
Yeah, you don't sound that old. How old are you?
58.
Yeah, that's not old at all, man.
I think I can still stab and steer. You know, I don't think I'm. I mean, look at Forrest. What is he, like 103 now? He's still out there driving. So,
Well, how about
plus he's had a lot of hard years. I think I still have a few years left in me.
And what about
it's just time. It's time for some adrenaline. You know, it's been too long, and I actually haven't even been to any events. I'm not a good spectator, so it's time to get back in the seat.
And what about the Greek out there still?
Exactly. Yeah, you've got the Greek out there. You've got Force, and so you know, I don't know that. I'm still talking to several people, and I don't know that I would do a whole season at this point with everything else I have going on. But never say never. If the opportunity presents itself and the sponsorship falls into place, I could certainly do the season.
So what got you into drag racing in the first place, Casey?
I've driven a lot of different things since I was a kid. I mean, I raced motocross when I was a kid, and I had, you know, go-karts and the whole thing, and then got out of racing for a while. My family's always been in the sprint car business, and so I toyed with the idea of driving some sprint cars. Ended up going road racing, drove Formula Super Vs, which is sort of now what they call the Indy Lights series, and then went stock car racing, ran some ARCA races for a few years, and got out of it again. My family was in the music business as well, and I was on the road, 300 plus days a year. My dad and I were actually on the road somewhere, and who knows where, and we're talking about, you know, we're together every day, we're on the road every day, but we don't really have any father and son time. You know, we don't really spend any time together. We're just in the same place at the same time, and both of us had always been interested in drag racing. My dad actually drove drag racing cars before I was even born, and so we decided to do an alcohol funny car. And I knew Frank Hawley from years, you know, previous, and went to the Frank Hawley school, got my license, and started with an alcohol funny car. Ran a few races in 1988. Ended up crashing the car in Houston, Texas. We built a brand new car, picked up Purolator filters as a sponsor for the 1989 season, for the whole season, and then switched to fuel funny car in '90. So it really started, you know, as crazy as that sounds, it just started as something for Dad and I to do together. And before we knew it, we had a crew and a tractor trailer and a race car shop. It got out of hand pretty quick.
Now, did you have any success with the alcohol funny car?
We won, let's see, in other than the crash in '88, that was pretty much the high point of '88 or the low point. In '89, we won 2 divisional races and ended up finishing 11th in the world in points. So it wasn't, you know, it wasn't a bad year. It wasn't the greatest year. Ronnie Swearingen, who was my fuel crew chief, was my alcohol crew chief as well, and alcohol was not exactly his cup of tea. Some of my other competitors used to joke around about, you know, sort of the whole tune-up. They would always ask if, you know, was the clutch tuned by Charlie Manson, that it was the most violent alcohol funny car they'd ever seen in their lives, and it was. I mean, it was a wild ride, that's for sure.
Now, what year did you finish with alcohol funny cars?
That was '89, and we made the decision sort of mid-year. Well, a little bit past mid-year, actually, to go ahead and switch to fuel funny car. for 1990, and everybody tried to talk me out of it after Donnie Gay had his fire in Seattle, but I was pretty well set that that's what I wanted to do, and Ronnie, his skill set was much more attuned to fuel than it was alcohol, and so I didn't listen to everybody, and we ended up switching to Fuel Funny Car in 1990.
Then that was it. After that, you got that nitromethane, and you were hooked on that, huh?
Yeah, exactly. It's a funny thing. Eddie Hill was one of the drivers that signed my upgrade license, and we stopped in Dallas, Texas on the way to the first race of the year in 90, which was the Winter Nationals, and I upgraded my license, and Eddie and Ursi watched every run. We made 3 runs, and then I videotaped it. Scott Coletta watched the videotape, and Scott actually was the second signature on my upgrade. But so we're sitting at breakfast the next morning, and all of us had, before we headed west, and Fuzzy Carter told me, he said, well, the boss wants you to come over and sit down with him and talk to him. And so I went over and sat down at the breakfast table with Eddie and Ursi, and I had all the time slips and the forms and everything. And Eddie looked at me and he said, is that the first time you've ever sat in that car? I said, yes. I said, well, actually, that's not true. I said, we warmed it up once at the shop in Tennessee before we put it in the trailer, and I was in the car when we warmed it up. But you've never driven that car. So that yesterday, the first run was the first time I've done anything in that car as far as driving it. And he said, I'm not sure I believe that. And I said, well, I'm telling you, that's the truth. Yesterday that's the first 3 runs I've ever made in that Fuel Funny car. And he said, there are guys out here that have driven Fuel Funny cars as long as I've been driving that don't look as good in a Fuel Funny car as you do. They don't do their burnouts as well. They don't back up as well. They don't drive the car as well. They don't do anything as well as you did. He said, either you're just a natural or that was a fluke. And I said, well, I feel really comfortable in the car. And I did. Ronnie was more comfortable with that car. And so Ronnie's confidence sort of, translated over to me. I was more comfortable in the car from the very get-go. And everything just came really naturally. The burnouts came naturally. Pre-staging, staging the car, everything came really naturally. And, so Eddie ended up signing my license, and then, like I said, Scott Coletta looked at the videotape. We were actually sitting out in California at Bob Brooks's shop, and Scott looked at the video, signed my license, and away we went. Of course, we go to Pomona, first race ever in a Fuel Funny car, first race as a pro, and I win the race.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, then the next race was Phoenix. I was number 1 qualifier in Phoenix.
Yeah, that's pretty, that's a pretty amazing story.
But like I said, it was just, I was never completely comfortable in the alcohol car.
Right.
I liked the alcohol car, but I was just never, ever completely comfortable in that alcohol car. But even with, the fuel car making obviously far more horsepower and being a more violent ride, so to speak, in general, I was from day one, first run one, more comfortable in that fuel car than I ever was in the alcohol car.
So how long did you campaign that car for?
We ran fuel in 1990. I actually had an offer to go Winston Cup racing, and I was encouraged to do so by T. Wayne Robertson, who was the president of Sports Marketing Enterprises for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. They wanted me to go NASCAR racing. And so I sold all the equipment in 1990, was going to work for a team that was based, the owner was based in California. The team was based in South Carolina. And, made the move to do that, and then literally everything fell apart with the owner and the sponsorship. And so, I made a move that didn't end up being a move. And, of course, in hindsight, that was the wrong move to make. But, that's the way it goes sometimes. And so I set out a few years and then came back in 94 and ran in 94 and 95.
Now, the Fruit of the Loom car, who are you driving that car for?
That was actually originally that was the team was co-owned by myself and Bob Vandergriff Jr. the first year, '94. And then about midway through the season, we had some differences, and so we split the teams apart. He owned the Top Fuel team. I owned the Funny Car. And then, of course, in '95, I owned the whole team myself. So I was owner driver. It's a good way it's job security that way. Nobody can fire you.
Yeah. So now, if you go back to driving a funny car, are you looking to own a car, or you just want to drive for somebody?
I don't know. I mean, I guess if it was the right sponsorship package, I would consider owning the team again. But I would also, if I was going to do that, I would look at even trying to do a second car by year 2 or 3, put another driver in there, and maybe bring some younger drivers up. But my real preference would just be to drive for somebody, and not worry about the business of the race team business. Just show up with my helmet bag and get in the car and drive the car. That has its pros and cons, though. When I went back to drive that Top Fuel car in 2003, the good people that I was driving for, I mean, I really liked the people that I was driving for. I liked the crews. I liked the crew chief. But, when you're not controlling all of that, things don't necessarily always happen in the manner you would do it if you owned the race team. I mean, I always prided myself in having a very professionally run race team. Everything looked good. It operated good. Yes, we played loud music in the pit area. Yes, we were the party boys, but we got the job done, and we always looked good. And that doesn't always happen if you're not controlling that. And that has weighed a little bit in my mind as I've made this decision to start driving again.
No, back when you were driving, they didn't have the 100-foot deal, right?
They didn't have the what? I'm sorry?
The 100-foot deal.
The 1,000-foot deal?
1,000-foot, sorry, 1,000-foot, yeah.
Yeah. We were running 1320 back then, obviously, the quarter mile, and of course now it's backed off to 1,000 feet, which I'm not crazy about. I think there are ways to run to 1,320 feet and keep the speeds to a range that Goodyear's happy about, that the insurance companies are happy about, but nobody asked me that, so.
Now, have you ever driven a nostalgia funny car?
I haven't. That was actually what got me interested in doing something again. Was somebody had sort of convinced me that maybe that was the way to go, and that didn't really seem to be panning out. And the more I thought about it, a buddy of mine that lives in Texas, Fred Spell, who's been around drag racing forever, Freddie said, if you're going to do this, why don't you just drive a big show car? And, so I started talking about that a little bit with Fred, and been having some conversations with Terry Haddock and Jeff Arendt, and I had a conversation months ago with Cruz Pedregon and Lee Beard and Jack Beckman was there. We were all kind of talking about it, and Cruz and I in particular had kind of an in-depth conversation about it, and Cruz told me, he said, look, you can still drive these cars. He said, I raced with you for years. There's no doubt in my mind you could sit in a funny car and go right back out there and drive a funny car. So that's been in the back of my mind as well, and so that's I sort of made the decision to go back and run the pro class at NHRA and just try to put all that together.
All right, so now, Casey, what do you enjoy most about being a drag racer?
Really the adrenaline, and I've driven a lot of different things. I've driven stock cars, road racing cars, go-karts, motorcycles, the whole thing. And, I've always told everybody that the thing about a fuel funny car is it's the most violent car I've ever driven. I mean, every time you strap in that car, you know that car's job is to try to hurt you. That's what it was built for. And it's your job to get it from point A to point B and not let it hurt you. And it's a challenge. I mean, a funny car is an incredibly violent race car, but I enjoyed every single part of that. You know, I never even mind the fires. You know, a lot of drivers that blowing it up and catching it on fire really bothers them, and never bothered me. You know, just get out of the car, fix it, and get right back in there. And you know, so it was that adrenaline rush. You know, that incredible speed, the incredible G-forces, and I enjoyed the fans. You know, I was fortunate that the fans liked me. You know, they wanted to talk, wanted autographs, they wanted to spend some time, and I really enjoyed the fans as well. So.
Now, is there anything that you hated about being a drag racer?
You know, the business of the team. You know, a lot of times, you know, that would get overwhelming, and you know, you're trying to tune everything out and get in the car and do your job, and you know, you're thinking about the sponsorship deals. You're thinking about all the bills that need to be paid. You're thinking about, you know, a crew member that's not happy. You know, all of those sorts of things are weighing on your mind. And, you know, radios sort of started to come around at the end of my career, and they all wanted to put radios in my car. I didn't want a radio in my car, because when I put my helmet on and got strapped in that car, it was just me in the car. Everybody, you know, as crazy as it sounds, it was my quiet time for the weekend. You know, that was my peaceful time. That was my stress-free zone. I didn't want a radio. I couldn't think of anything they could tell me on the radio in 5 seconds that I needed to know that I didn't already know. But that was, you know, it's not that I hated that part of the business. You know, it was just part of it. You know, that and the politics of NHRA. You know, which has always been, you know, sort of an interesting dynamic when it comes to drag racing, and obviously that hasn't changed any. But those were the two things that I least liked about drag racing.
Now, if you were able to change anything about the sport of drag racing, what would that be that you would want changed?
First of all, I think you need to go back to a quarter mile. I think you need to go back to 1,320 feet. And, you know, I think, you know, the fans want that. I don't care what anybody says. You know, you're never going to control costs in drag racing, so you can forget about that. You're never going to control costs in racing, period. NASCAR's trying, and everybody always finds a way around that. People with the bigger sponsorships, people with the bigger budgets, are always going to have things that other teams don't have. So there's no reason even looking at that. But I also think that you need to really take a look at what can increase TV viewership, what can increase attendance, and make that a business model that translates more to the race teams. Let the race teams be involved in that TV money and that attendance money, similar to what NASCAR does. You know, you have to take care of the folks that allow you to have the business, and that's the pro teams, and all of that trickles down. I'm certainly not anti-sportsman racer, and I've been on record saying this before, that it's the job of the pro teams. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it comes to safety or whether it comes to purses or whether it comes to you know, the things that Draw does. You know, the wonderful things that the Draw folks, the Drag Racing Auxiliary of Women, that they do. It's the job of the pro teams to support all of those things to make it better for the sportsman racers as well. Because let's face it, the vast majority of the fans that come to a drag race come to see the pro teams. That's just the way it is. So, you know, I think you've really got to look at that business model and focus on what you can do to raise revenue for the sport in general, and that comes through viewership and attendance, and how to get some of that translating back to the teams. If you don't do that, drag racing is in trouble.
So what would you consider to be the pros and cons of being a drag racer?
You know, to be honest about it, there really weren't any cons. You know, I mean, it's a great way to make a living. It really was. You know, I enjoyed every minute of it. I really did. And it's, you know, it's like being a professional ball player, except with high horsepower. You know, the fans that sit in those stands, the fans that watch on TV, the fans that support your sponsors have given you an opportunity to play for a living. You know, you're driving for a living. Is it a tough drive? Absolutely it is. Is it something that everybody can do? No. I mean, you're one of literally a handful of people in the world that can do what you do when you're driving a top fuel car or you're driving a fuel funny car. But it's a gift. And I think, you know, looking back on it, especially, you appreciate that more than you even did when you were doing it. And so there really weren't any cons. I mean, were there tough days? Were there? Yeah, absolutely. But that goes with any sort of business. I mean, overall, everything about it was a positive.
Now, if you didn't become a drag racer, you have any idea what you would have became?
I'd have probably been a drunk, you know, a homeless person and a drunk or something. I don't know. You know, everybody's always asked me that question. You know, it just sort of happened that way. It didn't really even start out that it was going to be a business. That it didn't start out that that's the way I was going to make my living. I was in the music business. My father was a concert promoter and a manager and incredibly successful. And, you know, I was sort of following that path with him, and, you know, drag racing just sort of took over, and that's the path I went. And, I mean, I certainly don't regret any of it. You know, like I said, I enjoyed every minute of it.
Now, if you do come back to the big show funny car racing, are there any drivers out there right now that you would love to line up with?
Well, I mean, all the guys that I used to race with, you know, I mean, Cruz Pedregon and Force and those guys. And, you know, a lot of the guys I used to race with aren't there any longer. And you know, so I look at some of the, you know, maybe the guys that I didn't race again, Ron Katz and Jack Beckman and those sorts of guys that, you know, I look forward to lining up with. And, of course, Tommy Johnson Jr. and I have been friends since 1988. So, you know, I'd really look forward to lining up against TJ and racing with him. You know, I never had a favorite opponent. I never had an opponent that I hated lining up against. I mean, they were all just the guy in the other lane. And you know, starting line games, staging games, they never affected me. And that used to drive some of the guys crazy, because there really wasn't anything they could do to me on the starting line that would throw me off my game. Now, conversely to that, I knew things about some of the other drivers. I could throw them off fairly easily. The left lane never mattered to me. The right lane never mattered to me. I mean, it was just go out there and do your job. But I mean, I look forward to all the guys. There was never anybody out there that I disliked racing. You know, when it doesn't matter who you're lined up against to. When you pull into that pre-stage bulb, it doesn't matter who it is in the other lane. You hate that person. It is your job to rip their throat out. But by the same token, if something happens in that other lane, as a competitor, as a professional, it's your job to get over there and help them. And I mean, I've done that several times, you know, with Frank Kramberger and you know, all of that goes out the window, and you're the guy that's closest to them that can help them and get them out of the car, or get them out of danger or whatever. Now it's a family member basically that's in that other car. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic, really, when you think about it. You know how that happens, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah, you remember years ago when they used to do the dry hopping?
Well, yeah, I don't really remember that, because that was before my time. But I mean, I've seen videos and that sort of thing, at the dry hops and all those sorts of things. Of course, I always used to do the big, long, smoky burnouts, and you know, nobody's doing those these days, and I'm sure that has to do with the fuel systems and the clutch systems. You probably can't do those these days, but I love doing it, and the fans loved it. They're hard to do. I never used a throttle stop. I did that all by feel and by sound, and And yeah, I don't think you can do those these days.
Now, if you could have, when you come back to racing, and if you could have fans remember one thing about you, what would you want fans to remember about you?
Well, I think the same thing that they remember about me now, is that I was always there for the fans. I mean, I can't ever remember leaving the racetrack if there was one single fan standing in line to get an autograph or to take a picture. I mean, I would stay there for hours. After the U.S. Nationals in 1994, we were runner-up. Cruz Pedregon beat us in the finals. And I think I was there for 3 hours after the race signing autographs, but I signed autographs until every single person that was there got an autograph, got a picture, got to say hello, got to chat, do whatever. Because you really appreciate those fans. They're, like I said before, they're really the people that make it possible to be a professional drag racer, either by buying a ticket or by watching it on TV or by supporting the name that's on the side of your car. That's why you're able to be out there and do what you love to do. So I think I would just like the fans to always remember that I was there for the fans. I was doing it for the fans, whether it was the big, long, smoky burnouts or, keeping my foot in it a couple of 100 feet further than anybody else would when the rods are hanging out the side and the thing's on fire, just trying to get it to the finish line. I was the guy that was out there to put on a show. I was the guy that was out there to entertain the fans.
Yep, as busy as you are in the pits, but if you see fans around there, you should always take at least a minute to go acknowledge them.
Absolutely.
Now,
and to my knowledge, I never ignored a fan. I can't remember in my mind a time that I ever ignored a fan or didn't take the picture, didn't sign the autograph, didn't spend some time, because that was always important to me.
Now, did you used to put kids in the driver's seat?
I'm sorry?
I said, did you put any kids in the driver's seat of the funny car when you were racing?
I'm sorry, I still couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Saying in the pit area, did you put any kids in the car?
We did. We used to do some things with Make-A-Wish, and I remember one particular time we were in Atlanta, I think, and actually my guys were the only team. There were several teams that were involved in Make-A-Wish. My guys were the only team that took the car out of the trailer, took the body off the car so the kids could go sit in it and have some fun. And my crew guys were I had the most incredible crew guys throughout my career. So I was standing there talking to some of the family members and some of the other kids, and there was a small a child that was in a wheelchair, and my crew guys asked the parent if they could pick him up and put him in the car, and the parent said, sure. And so my guys, 4 of them, picked this small boy up so gently and set him down in the funny car. And, of course, when he gets in my seat, he has just gone to town. He's yanking on fuel levers and the brake handle and the fire bottle release handle, which, obviously had the pin in it, so it couldn't go off. He's yanking on the steering wheel, and one of the parents, their eyes get really big, and they say, oh, my God, he's going to break something. And one of my crew guys looks at this parent and just so softly said, look, if he can't break it, pointing at me, we know he can't. And he said, even if he does break something, don't you worry about it. We'll fix it. Just let him have fun. And I was so proud of my guys for that. And when it was time for him to get out, again, they picked him up ever so gently and set him back in his wheelchair. And that those are the moments that you really sometimes look back on and remember, because you made such a difference in somebody's life, and it signing autographs. If we weren't servicing the car or there wasn't a lot going on and a kid wanted to sit in my car, I had no problem with that. Let the kids sit in my car. Now adults, generally you don't want adults to sit in your car because they've been known to go stupid and do things they shouldn't do. But kids, let them sit in there, let them have a big time. And like I said, my crew guys were always so good about that.
Yeah, that creates a memory of a lifetime for those kids.
It does, and especially these Make-A-Wish kids. That was always, it was one of those things that was just such a tough experience, personally, to do that, because you realized how sick these kids were, and what challenges they were facing. But for that day, for that moment, they were so happy and just, having the time of their life, and so it was always really an honor to be asked by Make-A-Wish to do that, and we never said no. Anytime they asked us to do that, we always said absolutely, just let us know where and when.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thing. So now, what was the fastest you've ever been in a Big Show funny car?
The funny car, I can't even, I think the fastest ET I had in the funny car was like 5 flat, something like 5.003. I mean, I didn't make the 4-second club, which, I hated. And my fastest mile per hour was 299.98, as well as I remember. Then when I went into the top fuel car, I think of course back then it was still quarter mile as well, but I think my fastest ET in the top fuel car was 471 at like 317 miles an hour or something.
Yeah, and of course these cars just keep getting faster and faster.
Yeah, we were talking about that. Jeff Arend and I were actually exchanging some messages the other day, and he was telling me about that. And I said, well, if they were any slower, it wouldn't be any fun. I wouldn't want to do it. So, speed is relative, and people that haven't been in that seat don't understand that. But you in your mind have it slowed down anyway, because you're so focused and you're so concentrated, and there's so much going through your mind, and so many decisions that you're making in milliseconds inside that car that a quick run doesn't seem as quick to you as it does to people watching it. Because you've slowed it down in your mind as you're focused on what you need to do. And so, the speed is relative, and you don't really even notice the speed as much until something goes wrong. And when you blow the rods and you're in your own oil, or the fire is so bad you can't see anymore. In Seattle, I blew a rear tire because the fire was so hot coming under the car. And so when those things happen, then things get real, and they get real quick. But again, it's your job. If you're sitting in that seat, it's your job to make the best of a bad situation, and that's what you see these guys out there do every single run. I mean, these runs that look like they're perfectly straight, that look like they go right down the racetrack, I can promise you they're not. A funny car is not built to go straight. A funny car doesn't want to go straight. It wants to go every direction but straight. And so even when the runs look like they're perfectly straight, I can promise you to the guy sitting in that seat, it wasn't. He was driving that car hard from the hit of the throttle until he got it shut down at the other end.
Now, Casey, when you first got into drag racing, did you have any drag racers that you looked up to?
Well, I mean, Raymond Beadle and I had been friends for years, and so I asked Raymond a lot of questions, and I always admired Raymond. I always admired Raymond as a driver. I admired him as a businessman. He was a real pioneer and a real entrepreneur in the drag racing world. Raymond created quite a little empire for himself, not only in drag racing, but he had a NASCAR team. He had a World of Outlaws sprint car team. Raymond was a sharp guy, and I liked talking to Raymond. I liked having the ability to have a conversation with him and brainstorm with him, and to be Raymond's friend. Frank Hawley and I were pretty good friends. We had run into each other on occasion, and I went to the Hawley drag racing school. Frank and I have completely different philosophies about a lot of different things. But I would certainly call Frank a friend, and I think if I needed any advice from Frank, he would certainly give that to me. of the competitors, back in the day that I was racing with, the ones that I could really call friends. John Force and I were really good friends. Most people didn't know that. They thought we were bitter enemies, and we weren't. John and I actually really liked each other, and were friends. Al Hoffman and I were great friends. I miss Al. Al was a really good guy and a hard racer. Chuck Etchells is now gone, and Chuck was a good guy. You could talk to Chuck about anything. Bruce Larson, I still run into Bruce every now and then, and Bruce was also one of those guys that you could, even as a competitor, you could sit down with Bruce and talk about things, business-wise or whatever that maybe you couldn't talk to everybody about, and you would always get a straight answer from Bruce, so, yeah.
No.
And of course, Don Gartlett. I remember I was telling this story not too terribly long ago. As a kid, when I would go to the drag races with my dad, you'd stand in line to get autographs from Gartlett, because he was the king. He was Big Daddy. And when we were at Pomona, that very first race, and I think it might have been before the semifinals or the finals. I can't remember which. But I look up. I'm sitting on the steps of my transporter, and Gartlett is like standing at my ropes, waiting for me to tell him that he can come in. It's like, oh my God, of course you can come in. And so he comes up and sits down next to me and gives me this, almost fatherly pep talk sort of thing. And not to be nervous, to race my own race, to do what I've been doing. And so we kind of were sitting there and he finally looks at me and he says, kid, he said, if you don't F this up, you're going to win this race. I just kind of started chuckling a little bit, but I mean, that was actually a really great moment, to have Gartlett's come up and have a little conversation with me and give me a little pep talk that meant a lot to me.
Wow. Yes. Now, when you would get out on the starting line with the funny car, did you have any pre-race rituals or superstitions when you're out there?
Not really. I always put my uniform on the same way every time. My gloves, I put my right glove on first, my inner glove and my outer glove. I always liked the same crew member to sort of help me on with my uniform every time. And I always shook his hand when I was completely suited up and ready to get into the car. Other than that, really, no. I mean, I was never a nervous driver. I can't tell you the amount of times I've fallen asleep in my chase car waiting to go out and make a qualifying run or even an elimination run because I was just, sitting there kind of bored and comfortable and would fall asleep. So other than the way I put my uniform on, that was pretty much it. I just did that the same way every time. Right. I'm not sure that was as much out of superstition as it was just sort of habit. Just do it the same way every time.
All right. Now, what were some of your favorite tracks?
I always loved Gainesville, Florida, for some reason. It was a party town. We always had a great time in Gainesville. Of course, Pomona was always really good to me, so I always enjoyed going to Pomona. Englishtown was one of my favorite racetracks. Loved Englishtown. And there were tracks that I liked, but maybe not necessarily for the racetrack. It was just sort of the area. I mean, I always loved going to Sonoma, California. That was a great area. Seattle. We always, enjoyed going to Seattle. And some tracks you enjoyed going to because of the people more so than the track. I mean, Bandimere Speedway in Colorado. I mean, you loved going to Bandimere because of John Bandimere, one of the greatest guys ever to have been involved in drag racing. And, John Bandimere made you feel like a guest in his home. He was just so gracious always. Billy Meyer at the Texas Motorplex in Ennis, Texas. You always enjoyed going to the Texas Motorplex, maybe not even necessarily because of the racetrack, but because of Billy, and the people that worked for Billy. Billy's always had the greatest people work for him, and Billy, again, is one of those guys that's just always gracious. You go down to Houston, Texas, and the Angels and the Gays that own Houston, same thing. It was so certain tracks, you liked for different reasons. There really wasn't a track that I particularly didn't like. There wasn't a track that I looked at and said, oh, we're going here, we're going there. I'd rather let's just get this over with. Because at the end of the day, they're all the same width and they're all a quarter mile long. And a lot of drivers would get, in their heads about some sort of racetrack. Columbus, Ohio used to bother a lot of race drivers, a lot of pro drivers because the shutoff was so short. Never bothered me. But again, at the end of the day, they're all the same width and they're all a quarter mile long.
Now, besides that accident you had in the alcohol funny car, have you had any other accidents?
I actually had 2 accidents in alcohol funny cars. I crashed the one in Houston in '88. I crashed a funny car at Pomona in '89. Other than just fires, that was pretty much it. Knock on wood. Those were the only 2 real crashes I ever had. A lot of fires. I seem to be on fire a lot. We were always pushing the envelope.
Now, can you remember what your most embarrassing moment was drag racing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really easy, actually. We were in Memphis, Tennessee, in my alcohol car, and I'd done the burnout, and I was backing up, and there's a little transition that's between the concrete and the asphalt at Memphis, and it's a rough transition. I mean, there's a gap between the 2. And it was just one of those things where, I had one hand on the steering wheel sort of lightly as opposed to really focusing on what I was doing. And the front end was shuddering just a little bit as I was backing up. And when I hit that transition, it spun the steering wheel out of my hand, and I backed it into the wall. That was pretty embarrassing.
Wow.
That is definitely my most embarrassing moment in drag racing.
All right, so what was the fondest memory of your drag racing career?
Boy, that's a tough one. I mean, most people would think it was winning, my first race, which is a fond memory. But, I think there are some memories that maybe didn't have anything to do with a win or a loss. And there's a lot of those out there, and most of them have to do with, an interaction with a fan or a child. Even some of those memories that maybe were a little painful, you look back on and realize the impact that you had on someone's life. We had a Make-A-Wish child that I actually kind of made an ass out of myself with Steve Gibbs from NHRA because we were going to do like a little match race where we'd put one of the kids in a rental car, and we'd race somebody else with a kid in the rental car. And we were in Atlanta, and they had some kind of construction going on in the sand pit at the end of Atlanta, and they wouldn't put us in rental cars, and we just kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And the young man that was there with me needed to go for treatment, and it's hot. So I go up into the tower, and Gibbs was in a meeting, and I got mad, and I said, do you really think that as a driver accustomed to going close to 300 miles an hour, I can't stop this rental car before I hit that tractor at the end of the drag strip? I said, by the time I get down out of this tower into the staging lanes, there better be cars down there for me to take these kids in rides, or I'm going to take them in my rental car. And he's just looking at me, and I walk out of it thinking, oh, this is going to be horrible. But there were, and then the next day he kind of laughed at it, and he said, look, he said, if you ever came up to me and said that because of something having to do with racing, you and I would have a problem. He said, but that was because of a kid, and, you were watching out for that kid, and I wasn't paying attention, and I was wrong, and so we're good. So anyway, later that year, we go to San Francisco, to Sonoma, and we were doing another Make-A-Wish deal. And we had our press conference downtown on Fisherman's Wharf. I'm driving like a madman in my rental car to get back to the racetrack in time for all of this. And so I show up, and we're standing there, and I met the child that I was going to be spending the day with, and his father was with him, and we're talking, to everybody before everything sort of starts. And one of the Make-A-Wish people said, you know, this is so wonderful. You don't really understand what an impact you make on these kids'